Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lyle Goldstein. I'm visiting faculty here at the Watson Institute of Brown University. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the third of our series on Sino-Indian relations. We've previously had Arvind Subramanian from the Watson Institute and Professor Lin Minwang as our second speaker. He's from Fudan University in Shanghai. Today I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Tanvi Madan, who is senior fellow and in the project on international order and strategy in the foreign policy program, and also director of the India project at the Brookings Institution, a very famous think tank in Washington, D.C. I'm sure you all know it well. She's also author of published by Brookings the 2020 book, Fateful Triangle: How China Shaped U.S.-India Relations During the Cold War. So we may all want to take a close look at that book. I might also direct you to a piece she had in the fall in the very prestigious journal Foreign Affairs, which is a very fine, I think, rendering entitled China Has Lost India. So she has a PhD from University of Texas, Austin, and a master's from Yale, and we're thrilled to hear her thoughts on this critical relationship. I might note, just starting out, that if I'm not mistaken, the Indian and Chinese foreign ministers just met in the last few hours, I think. So that's quite interesting. Maybe give us a little hope here. But anyway, okay, Tanvi, the floor is yours. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much to the Watson Institute, Lyle, to you, to Ellen as well for helping put this together. It's interesting that you mentioned the meeting today that's taking place on the sidelines, and I think just took place on the sidelines of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting with the Chinese Foreign Minister Qin Gang in Goa, in India, meeting with his Indian counterpart, External Affairs Minister Jaishankar. Partly because I want to take you back to 5 years ago, almost to the week, perhaps it would have been last week as opposed to this one, when Xi Jinping and Narendra Modi met in Wuhan for what was described as a bit of an oxymoron, an informal summit. But there was some hope among some quarters that this would be a reset of the relationship in 2018, just a year after India and China had been involved at the Bhutan-China-India tri-junction in a kind of a border incident and a crisis then. And so there had been some hope that you'd see kind of a resetting, not a resolution of China-India differences, but at least a stabilization of the relationship. And at that time, there was talk of kind of this approach of both, kind of cooperation and competition taking place side by side. I had written a piece then for War on the Rocks talking about how India essentially was following a policy and an approach of competitive engagement vis-a-vis China, where you did have those elements of cooperation and that had led to, for example, China becoming India's largest trading partner if you considered goods, cooperation between the two countries in the multilateral arena, particularly on issues like global economic governance, as well as with the formation of these groups like the BRICS, the Russia, India, China trilateral. So you saw those elements of cooperation. But you'd also, and this was, the point I'd made then with the competitive part of the competitive engagement approach that India was taking, you would also see kind of continued competition with potentially kind of conflict looming in the background. What we've seen today, 5 years on, is a very different kind of relationship and approach and perceptions, I think, on both sides, which is you've now seen kind of this move from a state of competitive engagement to what a former Indian foreign secretary and a former Indian national security advisors have called a state of armed coexistence between the two countries, largely as a result of something that happened 3 years ago, which is the boundary crisis of 2020, that in many ways continues to this day. Now, India has seen China as a geopolitical challenge since the late 1950s, alone and in conjunction with Pakistan. There's been concern about kind of a dual front threat, so to speak. And while kind of the degree of threat perception has varied in India over time, and there have been different approaches taken, this kind of concern about China, seeing it as a geopolitical challenge, has remained a consistent element for Indian foreign and security policymakers. And at the heart of this concern about and competition with China lies the kind of border dispute between the two countries. This is the two countries have the largest undemarcated or the longest undemarcated boundary in the world. They have competing claims to territories that the other holds. In China's case, they claim what India calls the state of Arunachal Pradesh, and India claims the area in the western sector of the border called Aksai Chin that China holds. And so you have these competing claims, and this border dispute has been the result of the two countries, or has resulted in the two countries fighting a war in 1962, as well as kind of various skirmishes and standoffs that took place in kind of the 60s, but also right through to in the 70s, and then right through to the 80s. But you saw after that a period where from about 1988, when Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi traveled to Beijing, the first prime minister to do that for decades, he traveled to Beijing, and that sparked a process between the two countries that led to about 5 agreements signed between China and India between 1993 and 2013. And so you saw essentially a 25-year period where you saw the two countries agreeing and laying out the basis for to manage the boundary dispute, and potentially pave the way for them to resolve it. But it was about managing the boundary dispute to allow those areas of cooperation that I talked about, and that's what saw that economic cooperation, multilateral cooperation actually made possible by essentially saying, look, we're going to maintain peace and tranquility at the border through these agreements while exploring this broader relationship. But you saw that change a little bit, and you didn't see for many years, from about 1988, there was a major boundary crisis in 1986-87, but then you saw a period where for about 25 years, you didn't see another major boundary crisis between the two countries. You did see an India that had started becoming concerned about a more assertive China since about 2008, 2009, where particularly what Indian policymakers started becoming concerned about was they thought this was now a country in China that was less willing to kind of bide its time and hide its capabilities and intentions, and they particularly see an assertiveness grow from their perspective after the global financial crisis. The sense of China's time has come. And so you started seeing that already change in 2008, 2009, but from how India saw it, it was really since Xi Jinping's ascension to power that the boundary itself, so not just assertiveness across the region or concerns about China's forays into the Indian Ocean, but the boundary dispute starts flaring up again after Xi Jinping comes to power. And you saw boundary crises in 2013, then again in 2014, and then, as I mentioned, in 2017 at the Bhutan-China-India tri-junction. But it's really while those boundary disputes crises took place, it was really this 2020 crisis that I mentioned that has reflected a watershed moment for the two countries, and I would say put the countries on a pathway that isn't. It leaves one quite pessimistic about the future. Why is this different? I think the recent boundary crisis, which took place not at one disputed point on the border, but at multiple locations, has been the most serious one in decades. New Delhi saw the People's Liberation Army as having and accused it of unilaterally trying to change the status quo using force at multiple locations rather than just one, as had been the case in previous crises. This crisis, which began in about April, May 2020, with what India saw as China moving forces and cutting off India's access to certain areas, or cutting off its access to patrolling points. This led not just to a boundary crisis where both sides had different views, or you saw a fatal clash take place in June 2020. This involved the first fatalities at the China-India border in 45 years, and the first shots fired at the boundary in decades, and larger deployments from both militaries as well. At some of the contested locations, the two militaries have disengaged over the last few years, but they continue to face off at other locations, and there's been no de-escalation of forces near the boundary. So they've disengaged, so no longer kind of face-to-face, but the escalation of military deployments continues across the board, and there's some points they haven't even disengaged at. This boundary crisis, as I mentioned, because it has not been resolved in terms of the 2020 issues, it really has, and because it's continued to this for now 3 years, it has brought the China-India relationship to its lowest point since the two countries fought a war in 1962. And what is worrying about it is, in terms of kind of the meeting that we talked about between Dr. Jaishankar and Foreign Minister Chen Gang, you see they met recently elsewhere as well. You see the two sides take a very different view of what the path ahead is. You see kind of China saying, or India saying, look, we cannot move forward with the broader relationship. It cannot go back to normal till the situation at the boundary, at the border, is abnormal. And so we need to have that return to peace and tranquility, to status quo ante, before we can go back to business as usual in the broader relationship. China is taking a very different stance. It's saying it's flipped flipped that and said, look, India, put the border issue in its proper place, set it aside. Whatever happened at the border happened. Let's move forward with the broader relationship. So at the moment, you have two almost diametrically opposite stances on what the path ahead should be. And so what you've seen is kind of the 2020, in not just this pathway, it's really been an inflection point. And the longer kind of we continue with these two very different visions of of what the path ahead to resolve this crisis is, the longer the more this will represent an inflection point in the India-China relationship, and particularly from India's point of view. And I'll lay out the reasons for why this is an inflection point. And it is not just because of the boundary crisis. I will point out that the other thing that in 2020 really concerned India was China's handling of COVID, which hardened views in India and really made India think about what it meant to be next to a country that it wasn't just a rival, but that wasn't a democratic rival in the sense that it had a system which was closed and which was not transparent, and what the ramifications were for the health of Indians, for the security of Indians as well, that it was hard to actually, that what it meant to live next to a country whose kind of, intentions weren't clear and could move at any point. So it was kind of this COVID plus border crisis moment at 2020 really reflected a change. And that hardening of views has meant a few different things. So on the one hand, you see kind of the Indian government seeing Beijing as having violated the boundary agreements that I mentioned. And the problem that this has set up is that you now have a strain of thought in India that you cannot trust that China will respect any of its other commitments that were made. So even getting back to a pathway, so even if you got to a point where you'd have a China-India discussion about stabilizing the border, now you're in a situation where Indian policymakers say, look, we can stabilize relations, but we cannot trust that China will not violate any agreement again. And so what that has meant is, one, it has meant a fundamental change in what this border between China and India and the deployments on both sides are going to look like. On the ground, this will mean, already has meant, more forward deployed troops at the China-India border, because there will be concern in Delhi that the PLA will try to salami slice more and grab more disputed territory in the future. Second, it has meant that in terms of military capabilities and infrastructure, you've seen on both sides now very much more enhanced deployments. You've seen the building of infrastructure on both sides so that they have quicker access to this border. You've also seen in India kind of, for the first time in decades, India redeploying troops from its Pakistan border to its China border, or from counterinsurgency duties in India's northeast towards the China border. And third, I think, other than kind of the border itself and how India is thinking about it, the military capabilities and infrastructure, you've seen, at least in India, a change in the debate about China within India. It had the crisis, this border crisis since 2020, has weakened the hands of those in the Indian government who had been arguing that greater economic engagement with China would alleviate political strains. If anything, it has accelerated Indian concerns about its economic and societal exposure to China. So you've seen kind of a shift from from this idea of economic engagement and social engagement and connectivity with China as an opportunity, to really starting to see it as a vulnerability. Another kind of impact is of this border crisis is that it has exacerbated broader concerns in India about China that have existed. And I'm just going to lay out briefly kind of what these other concerns other than the border was. The border was the kind of the fundamental dispute between the two countries, but there are a range of other differences that have existed, but they were being managed because it was largely seen as I said, this competitive engagement approach, which is that there was a value in continuing to engage and deepen cooperation with China in some domains. But now, because this border crisis has changed minds about also level of trust in China, you see the exacerbation of all these other concerns. What are some of these concerns? Some of them are bilateral. So there's a river water sharing dispute between the two countries. The river, particularly that India calls the Brahmaputra, which China is the upper riparian for, concerns about whether it is river diversion, whether it is damming of waters, whether it is, could China use its upper riparian role in a crisis as leverage. There was some concern during a previous border crises that the mechanisms in place that China and India have for hydrological information sharing, China had stopped sending that information during a crisis. There was some concern, is China using this as leverage or to signal that it could use this? So you have on the bilateral front this kind of river water sharing dispute. There's the other kind of bilateral dispute has been on Tibet. China finds the presence and often complains about the presence and the activities of the Dalai Lama and several Tibetan refugees in India, and it sees that as a source of concern and difference. Beyond kind of these political differences on the bilateral front, there have been a range of economic differences. This is, as I had said, one thing that had changed for the better. This was supposed to have helped alleviate the strains, but those very economic ties, much like in the US, has now become a source of friction in China-India ties. India is concerned about the vulnerability of India to Chinese economic coercion due to overdependence. But even before this kind of post-crisis, the concern had been about the asymmetry of the economic relationship, the lack of reciprocity, the concern that India wasn't getting access to, for example, the Chinese market, while there was a huge trade imbalance because India was importing a lot from, so just to give you a sense, in 2022, India-China's trade was $140 billion. Of that, $100 billion was the deficit that India had with China. So the imbalance and the asymmetry, whether it was in trade, investment, tourism, even just broader travel between the two countries, there was an asymmetry. And so those concerns have become exacerbated now. Beyond the bilateral concerns that have become intensified, there's a set of regional concerns that India has had about China. primarily the China-Pakistan relationship, for example, which goes back to the 1960s with Indian concerns that China had helped build its other rival up, particularly through enhancing Pakistan's conventional missile and nuclear capabilities. And in recent years, this China-Pakistan relationship had gone beyond a military-to-military or political relationship with kind of the China-Pakistan economic corridor. So this had become a broader, even economic relationship with Indian concerns about what this meant about Chinese presence now in Pakistan beyond kind of a relationship. So both its military presence, economic presence, particularly dual-use port infrastructure as well being developed. The kind of the added concerns over the last, I would say, decade or so, maybe more now, about 2 decades, had been Indian concerns about China's expanded and growing presence in India's territorial and maritime neighborhood, including, but not only through the Belt and Road Initiative. In fact, these concerns precede the Belt and Road Initiative. The concern wasn't just about the economic impact in terms of India concerned about the fiscal implications for the country. Some of these projects weren't seen as having any commercial value, and so there were questions about what this was doing to debt burdens in these countries for infrastructure that wasn't going to be used. But there was not also concern about the strategic and political implications of this economic influence that China had, about whether China was going to become and was becoming more active in trying to shape politics in these countries because of its economic engagement there, something India likes to reserve the right to do itself. But also the fact that there was concern that China was encouraging these countries not to respect India's red lines in terms of Chinese military activities and political activities in these regions. And so that China was not just saying, do these things with us, saying, don't do X, Y, or Z with the US, with Japan, with India. So that was a concern. I think regionally, there was also, by the way, the flip side of the kind of Indian concern about China's engagement in India's neighborhood was China's concern about India's engagement in particularly in Southeast Asia, but also with major powers in the region, including the US, Japan, and others. And I'll come back to that and why I think it'll add to the kind of intensification of the India-China competition. But beyond kind of the regional concerns about whether it's China's ties with Pakistan, China's ties with other South Asian countries, or China's concern about India's ties in its neighborhood, and you see this problem being exacerbated by the fact that the two countries essentially have overlapping peripheries. Beyond this kind of, on the broader regional side, there is a sense in India that China and India have fundamentally different views and visions of the region, whether you want to call it Asia or the Indo-Pacific. India believes that China wants a multipolar world, maybe, but it wants or maybe a bipolar world, but it wants a unipolar Asia, which Beijing gets to set the terms. India believes that there should be a multipolar Asia. There is also a difference where India, unlike China, sees the US not as an outsider in the region, but a resident power whose power and influence should be maintained, if not grown, increased in the region. Different from, so India rejects this idea of Asia for Asians that it believes that China has and sometimes tries to propound. And as part of this kind of concern about China's, it's not about Chinese power so much in the region, or kind of the unipolarity is just a power dynamic. What India is concerned about is the behavior that it's leading to in the region. Real concerns for India about unilateral changes of the status quo. And you heard a very kind of, perhaps the toughest speech that a senior Indian official has made recently, with the chief of army staff making a speech where he talked about the region, and not just in terms of India's disputes. He clubbed together China's forays in the South China Sea, its rejection of international tribunal and, awards and maritime claims, and what he called the activities in the Taiwan Strait and actions along the line of actual control at the India-China border. He clubbed these all together as China's view that might makes right in the region. And so you have these kind of regional concerns that India believes are kind of divergent views of what they would like to see in the region. And finally, on kind of the broader concerns that you have that have got exacerbated, is on the global side, in the multilateral sphere. So you have the bilateral, regional, and multilateral. And amongst the kind of global concerns, there has been a belief in India now over a number of years, which has got exacerbated over the last 3, that India thinks China is out to block India's rise, or sometimes very actively its membership in various international organizations, whether that's in a reformed UN Security Council. China is the only country, for example, that has not endorsed membership for India, permanent membership for India in a reformed Security Council, if that ever happens. China's also been very active in blocking Indian membership of the Nuclear Suppliers Group. But India also at the global and kind of global environment sees China, and now worryingly for India, occasionally Russia actually helping Pakistan out when there are India-Pakistan issues being debated, including in the Sanctions Committee, where India has been working with the US and France to get certain terrorists based in Pakistan designated. So India sees at the global level that essentially China is being unhelpful, if not actively harmful, to Indian interests. Underlying all this, of course, even at the global, regional, and bilateral, has been a fundamental lack of trust in India about China, both about its intentions. You had a foreign secretary say to the Indian parliament a few years ago, and I quote, "A number of steps that the Chinese before had said they would not do are being done. This includes the establishment of foreign bases abroad, as well as the sending of military personnel abroad." And in this, he was talking about Djibouti in particular, where he said essentially it's removed the veil of any ambiguity. And this is a particular concern to India because it's on the Indian Ocean littoral. There's also a lack of trust, not just in terms of intentions, but commitments. As I said, it goes back to this idea that China does not, you can reach agreements with it, but it does not respect these agreements. And so you've seen this exacerbation. I think, that was kind of the third area where we've really seen, the fourth area, you've seen border dispositions, the enhancement of military capabilities, the debate in India and China, and this exacerbation of broader concerns about China. And what all this has led to is a couple of other dimensions, which I think makes now this competitiveness sticky, so to speak, which is that all these concerns has led to changes in Indian domestic and foreign policy that will, the longer this border crisis continues, not the broader dispute, but the crisis that has been ongoing, the more these get locked in. And so I think this will make it, at least from the Indian side, very hard to move away from. On the domestic policy side, what you've seen is a series of measures over the last few years that restricts or increases scrutiny of Chinese activities in several domains in India, including economic, technology, telecommunications, public diplomacy, and education. By no stretch of imagination is this a decoupling, because you look at India-China trade figures, they're still high, even though I think the nature of India-China trade will change over the next few years because of some of these restrictions. But you really do see a de-risking or disentangling effect, particularly in anything that has to do with critical supply chains or critical infrastructure in India. And so you've seen a limitation in civil society exchanges as well, for instance. So you've seen that change in domestic policy. There is also in domestic politics, parties now competing to be tough on China, so to speak. And so you've seen kind of that aspect. On the foreign policy side, what this has led to, this intensification of India's concerns about China, it's led to a couple of different things. One, it has limited in the utility that India sees, or what it sees as the value of groupings like the BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa grouping, the SCO, which is having its foreign ministerial summit, and India will be hosting the summit of leaders very soon over the summer. It has limited the utility of these groupings that were built around this kind of Russia, India, China grouping. What it's done is where you had seen kind of India see value in these kind of multilateral groupings and engagement with China. India-China tensions are now limiting not just India's use of them, but what these organizations can do and the common stances that these groupings can take. Now, from a Western perspective, that's not a bad thing because it's essentially stalling what these alternative, and as these groupings, particularly with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, have made, these groupings have become more anti-West in part than non-West. And so they now have limited utility for India. Having said that, the India-China intensification has simultaneously meant India's desire to continue to maintain a partner with Russia, even if it's not just through these organizations, but a bilateral partnership, which explains in part its approach to the Russian invasion, its response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because also, but simultaneously, it wants to maintain this partnership with Russia that had traditionally been part of India's balancing strategy vis-a-vis China, even as it is concerned about growing China-Russia alignment, which India has watched. It's not something that India is concerned about now. India's been concerned about China-Soviet and then China-Russia relations and watches it very closely since kind of at least 1949, if not before. And finally, and I'll kind of wrap up with this, is a major element of India's foreign policy that has been kind of intensified because of this enhanced competition between India and China is India doubling down and speeding up on its balancing partnerships with like-minded countries. And that includes the US, Japan, Australia, France, Britain, South Korea, countries in Southeast Asia as well that are like-minded. And for India, particularly with these kind of major powers, what are these countries bringing to the table for India? They're helping India build its own capabilities. The China-India capabilities gap has only grown over time. 30 years ago, China and India had economies the same size. Today, China's economy is more than 5 times that of India. Its defense budget is more than 3 times that of India. So these partnerships are helping India, for one, help build its own capabilities over time. Second, these partners help offer alternatives in the region, which is why you're also seeing India that can't compete with China on scale in South Asia and the Indian Ocean region, or speed sometimes, is really gone from saying, having its own Monroe Doctrine for South Asia and the Northern Indian Ocean region, saying external powers should stay out, now saying, look, we want to see more US in the Indian Ocean, not less US. They're working with Japan on connectivity projects, for instance, as well. There's an India-Japan-Bangladesh trilateral that's working on economic development as well. So building capabilities, helping offer alternatives. The third way, I think, more broadly, that India sees these partners as useful is in maintaining a favorable balance of power in the region, and ideally in deterring further Chinese military action. So I'll stop there and happy to take questions.
Okay, Tanvi. Yeah, wow. Lots to talk about there, and a lot of fascinating points. It's very clear that you follow the relationship super closely. I get there are some questions in the Q&A, and I invite other listeners to add some questions. I'll definitely delve into those. Maybe I'll take the privilege though to ask the first question. Well, you did mention the Ukraine war a little bit and India's relations with Russia, but I mean that for world politics, I guess that is the biggest news, and it's very disturbing to everyone, I think. But I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on how that's impacted. I mean, because I guess in theory, I mean, in a way, China and India have behaved similarly, reacted similarly. That is, neither are. I mean, they're both trading more with Russia, and I know India's got a lot of criticism on that. But the other question on diplomacy, another big story from the last couple of months has been this breakthrough in Iran-Saudi relations that seems to have come about because of Beijing's mediation. And on that, well, I mean, on the one hand, does that show, maybe we should be a bit more positive about Chinese foreign policy, but also, is that a geopolitical hit for India because, China's growing influence in the whole Middle East and in the Gulf in particular? So let's start with those questions.
Big questions. Let me go to India, Russia first. I think just on the invasion, one thing I'll start with, it was quite interesting that about this time last year, then still Foreign Minister Wang Yi was in India, and this was the first kind of in-person meeting since the boundary crisis in 2020, or the first bilateral, because the foreign ministers had met in the sidelines of various summits, but he was there for a one-day visit, and part of the reason he seemed to have gone was to, and this was just after, it was a couple of months after the Russian invasion, it was to try to portray India's position on the Russian invasion as being the same as China's. And in fact, the Chinese readout of the meeting said, that there was a need for China and India to speak with one voice along with Russia on these matters, and talked about things that India and China do agree on more broadly, which is things like unilateral sanctions not be good, and where India does share concerns is where it's thought that some of Russia's security concerns had not been taken into account with NATO expansion and others. The Indian foreign minister was very clear about highlighting, though, when he was asked about whether China and India had the same position, that he did not think that was the case. And in fact, he said, look, they have their view and we have our view, and that includes and a belief in the international order and the UN Charter being respected, mentioned kind of violations of territorial integrity and sovereignty. And in this was a dig not just at China, but at Russia as well, that, agreements, you should not be using force to resolve disputes, or the threat of use of force to resolve differences, no matter what they were. You've also seen, I think, India, even in its engagement with Ukraine, try to draw a distinction. So you've seen there's UN voting pattern as well. There have been a few votes that China's been more supportive, India's abstained, and its statements at the UN been far more critical about Russia, even without naming Russia. In certain cases, making very clear who, when the Russians were issuing kind of nuclear threats, making very clear that whether it was that or the threat to suspend the Black Sea Grain Initiative, that India was very clear that it was Russia that was causing instability and was the problematic party in that case. But the other place you've really seen is with the engagement with the Ukraine. So with Ukraine, where you saw till very recently, till the Xi-Zelensky call recently, there hadn't been any high-level engagement between China and Ukraine, whereas Modi had talked to Zelensky three times at least. India had sent humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. India was one of the first countries to reopen its embassy in Kyiv and engage with kind of the National Security Council in Ukraine as well. And then you also had India welcoming the Ukrainian deputy foreign minister recently as well. So India was very clear that, look, its position wasn't China's position. I think for India, this situation is it does not like the Russian invasion. It has not endorsed it. It will talk about that it does not support the Russian invasion, and that it is criticized, even if not Russia, its actions. And I think the reason for not, why does it abstain versus, there's the broader issue that India doesn't believe in things, or says it doesn't believe in things like unilateral sanctions and those things. But I do think, there are certain, if you look at the Russia-India relationship even before the invasion, the divergences between the two countries had increased, or the convergences had decreased from particularly the Cold War. But nonetheless, Russia remained relevant to India in a few different ways. One, and I think primarily as a defense supplier. While India has slowly been diversifying away over the last decade away from importing military equipment from Russia, anywhere from 60 to 80%, estimates differ, of India's frontline military equipment still is of Russian or Soviet origin. And so, especially as at the time it's in a live crisis with China, or a potentially live crisis with China, for India, it cannot have further supply chain disruptions. And they've already been disrupted not just because of from Russia, from Ukraine as well, which had been a supplier of parts, key components, including Russian frigates that India buys have Ukrainian engines on them. And so you saw kind of particularly the defense side being a driver. Second, India has always had a concern. It's been an Indian strategic objective to keep China-Russia relations from getting closer. The basis of the India-Soviet relationship and the treaty they signed in 1971 was for India an insurance policy against China. It was when Soviet-China relations were at their depths, but India had benefited from it. Now, India has been seen as steadily growing and aligning China-Russia relationship. And so while that has been a subject of concern, India's desire not to isolate Russia has been to make sure it has a non-China option as a partner, so it doesn't go all in. And from a crisis perspective, India's objective is, it doesn't think that Russia is suddenly going to take India's side in a China-India crisis. What India doesn't want is for Russia to take China's side. So it wants to keep Russia neutral. There are other reasons why Russia is relevant. It's things like Russian membership of various international organizations where it can be either helpful or harmful to Indian objectives. There's also this aspect of certain kinds of defense equipment that only the Russians, or technologies that only the Russians agree to provide India, including kind of co-developing and producing missiles or nuclear-powered submarine technology. There are some kind of legacy interests, but I think that's less so. This was not a very broad relationship. It was largely kind of defense, and it was a government-to-government relationship. I put less weight on the energy dimension. Yes, India is importing more oil, and at this point, actually, especially from the U.S., criticism has decreased because it is, from an energy perspective, you don't want to take all that Russian oil off the market, and India has largely been buying it either at or around the price cap, even though it doesn't officially subscribe to that. But and incidentally, a lot of the oil that India is importing is getting refined and exported to the West. So, we need to stop, be a little bit more honest about our consumption. And I think the Europeans are particularly the market for this, of where that oil is going. But largely, the reason I don't worry about that energy side as much, January 2022, Russian oil imports was 2% of India's oil imports. Now they're up to maybe 30, 35%, but they can go back down. This is very price dependent. So it's not going to be kind of a long-term, necessarily a long-term engagement for India. India is quite price sensitive. So, I think that's been the reason, which is it wants to keep. Having said that, over time, I think, for India, just kind of very briefly, the Russian invasion, why it's actually been quite upset about this, it has actually adversely affected several Indian interests, including in terms of the increase in commodity prices and the hit that everybody's economies have taken. India was just coming out of COVID. It's actually the fastest major growing economy, but nonetheless, the prospect would have been even higher. And India, not just from an economic point of view, with higher commodity prices, but also from a political point of view, where especially fuel prices actually have an impact, as do kind of food and fertilizer prices. So from an economic and political point of view, India is not happy. From a defense, even a military supply point of view, supply chain disruptions. And now, for example, India and Russia have not been able to figure out a way for India to pay supply for some of these supplies, so Russia is not delivering it anymore. Or Russia is not able to deliver them because they need the military equipment for their own needs. So you've seen the disruptions there. The Russian invasion has put pressure on India's key relationships with the West as well. And I think the biggest thing for India, perhaps strategically, is that the invasion is making Russia more beholden to or dependent on China. And so this question in India's mind is, when China asks Russia to do things that are not in India's interest, will Russia now have no choice but to say, yes, China, we will lean more towards your side than India's, or yes, China, we will actually engage with Pakistan much more than we were in the past. So I think broadly, yes, you see an India that is not going to align with others to isolate Russia, but is not happy and will not endorse. And you saw this particularly the recent G20 ministerials, that despite some of these reports we saw about some of these documents that were leaked, India actually did, not just allow a discussion of the war in the G20 ministerials, but because a consensus couldn't be reached about a statement, actually said in their chair's statement, put in the language on that from the Bali leaders' declaration on the war and how it had been harmful, and said, look, the two holdouts in agreeing to, 18 of us agreed. It was two countries, Russia and China, who didn't. So you do see some of this. You've also seen India be very careful about not doing what China has done, which is, amplifying Russian disinformation, like these things about bioweapons labs, or the Russian line about NATO being at fault. So India's, whatever it thinks about NATO expansion, it is not being a source of that information. So I think it's a pretty complicated approach, and it's one reason why you've seen whatever concerns the Biden administration continues to have about India's engagement with Russia. It continues to give platforms to Lavrov. Putin will probably travel there, if not for the SCO summit, then the G20 summit, or rather, if not for the G20 summit, that the SCO summit in the summer. But nonetheless, despite these concerns, I think the Biden administration sees that in the long term, a weaker Russia will actually be of less utility to India and less close to India. Just very quickly on the Middle East, and I know there are other questions, but I think it's important in one sense. I think much like the U.S., for India, if China's efforts lead to more stability in the Middle East, that is for the world's benefit, and for India's benefit, given that it has over 7 million Indian citizens who live and work in the region. That is still the major source. The Middle East is still the major source of oil and gas, imported gas for India. And so, it has a lot of investments in the Middle East, and it would like to see a stable Middle East. Does it? And one of its concerns has been over time is this kind of Iran and GCC competition. So if that puts less on pressure on India to make choices. But does it worry about Chinese inroads in the Middle East? Yes, I think, but it's very specific things. So, for example, it's not about China's role as a peacemaker per se. One question for India would be, are these countries, in order to curry favor with China, or do other countries like in Europe, if they see China playing these kind of roles as a peacemaker, will they make concessions to China on kind of core interests of India's? And second concern will be kind of the relative. India's been engaging with these countries economically as well as strategically, is issues like, if the UAE, which India has been engaging with bilaterally, but also through trilaterals like the France, UAE, India trilateral, or a quad, which is US, Israel, UAE, India. If the UAE is allowing, for example, a dual use port or engaging in security collaboration with China, that would be of concern to India. So in some ways, it almost closely mirrors US concerns, which is, yes, if you bring stability, great, but what does that mean for our very parochial interests? And is China actually going to start being harmful to those?
Okay, well, that's great. Very helpful. Can you, there are a lot of questions here. I don't think we'll get to all of them, but maybe I can summarize a few of them. The first one from Elena Kosheka has asked about whether non-state foreign actors may be maligning India's interests in DC, and she mentions Al Jazeera as a problem, but and it sounds to me like kind of a concern about Chinese influence, influencing media coverage on China. Is that something you worry about?
Not as,
I mean, media coverage about India, excuse me.
Yeah. I don't worry about it as much. I think, it's not been as much of a major issue. I think you've seen more kind of active influence operations in terms of backing up Russian positions and things like that here. But there's I think one thing that's in some ways helpful, though some people in India who criticize the Western media might not think otherwise. The good thing about open societies is, and a society where you have a large number of English speakers and a lot of English reporting, is you for good and bad, you kind of see And in some ways, that is actually more stabilizing, that you actually, and because of the transparency, you actually see development. So it's actually harder. You'll see, you see this in the amount of time the Biden administration, and frankly, on a bipartisan basis, on the Hill, the efforts that countries, that officials have made vis-a-vis India. The Biden administration has spent more time in its 2.5 odd years on India than any previous American administration in history, for a variety of reasons. So, I don't think, there are concerns. There are often complaints in India about the Western media, not so much the Chinese media, but I don't think it's so much Chinese influence operations yet. This might change over time, or other foreign operators as well.
Okay, another question is a second question from Sanjay Ruparelia. He says, he says, maybe are you attributing like too much, you're putting Xi Jinping too much at fault when maybe he says you're talking about two avowed strong men, and saying both countries have these kind of grand national ambitions, and wondering if it's more should we take a more even-handed say, maybe just bring in something Lin Minwang said from Fudan. He was quite emphatic that, not surprisingly, but he felt that Indian domestic politics, that like in the United States, people are, this sells to the public a kind of, xenophobic and kind of China fear mongering and so forth. So do you think that has any explanatory power?
So I'll tell you why I think it's somewhat different. I think one, as whatever, there's a distinction between the Modi government talking about the threat of Pakistan versus China, and it's entirely dependent on capabilities. India is kind of larger capabilities wise, and you have seen the Modi government kind of talk about Pakistan in domestic politics sense. The Modi government's actually been quite cautious about China, to the effect that, in fact, people in India are criticizing the Modi government for not actually acknowledging what is happening at the China-India border, particularly pointing to a speech he made where he said, and he used a Hindi term, but that nobody had entered and nothing had happened, which obviously raised the question amongst a lot of people, then why is the relationship abnormal or the border abnormal now? Mm-hmm. In fact, you actually saw in 2014, when Modi came in, a belief. In fact, his initial engagement, he had been sanctioned by the U.S. as chief minister of the state of Gujarat, hadn't visited the U.S., but he'd gone to China 4 times and engaged with them economically, had a lot of admiration, in part because of kind of, I think he did appreciate not just kind of strongmen, so to speak, but the East Asian Tigers model. It wasn't just China, it was kind of what Korea had achieved, what Japan had achieved, what Singapore had achieved, and Taiwan as well. And, this idea that manufacturing, infrastructure, these are the kind of things China and these other East Asian countries had done really well. And so you actually had, and if you look at China, the kind of reporting from that initial phase, particularly in 2014, to some extent in 2015, this was a Modi, Prime Minister Modi, who actually wanted to engage. His first major foreign visitor of the major powers was Xi Jinping. The first major kind of second level visitor was Wang Yi as foreign minister. The Chinese also thought, this guy, we can do business with him. But you saw kind of Modi being did not meet the Dalai Lama, as most new Indian prime ministers did, in public. I mean, he met behind the scenes. It was a bit like President Obama in his initial years, the Dalai Lama having to go through the back and no publicity. And so you saw kind of a Modi who actually did want to focus on economic and business, but you see that deteriorate really quickly when Xi Jinping was in India in September 2014. One of these border crises happens then. In 2015, Modi goes to China trying to convince Xi Jinping that, look, don't put the China-Pakistan economic corridor, which goes through disputed territory between India and Pakistan, don't put it as part of your featured project and Belt and Road Initiative. But of course, just before he goes, Xi Jinping goes to Pakistan and endorses the CPEC as a flagship of the BRI. And then you see these, 2017, and then again in 2018, much to domestic criticism, this Wuhan summit that I mentioned, and then in 2019, a summit in southern India. This was criticized domestically as, but this was Modi giving Xi Jinping the benefit of the doubt, and partly because India doesn't have the capability necessarily, and he doesn't want an unstable border. So I know we like to think, and Sanjay, good to at least see you, I guess. But we like to think that these leaders are the same, but I think capabilities here do matter, and I don't think Chinese assertiveness is only vis-a-vis India, right? In 2020, this wasn't just assertiveness vis-a-vis India. It was assertiveness vis-a-vis being more active in the South China Sea, ramming, a Malaysian oil rig, harassing Vietnamese vessels, increasing incursions over Taiwan, pressing the Australians in terms of economic coercion, going forays into disputed waters with the Japanese. And so we saw this kind of broader effort. Now, we still, I think, debating what causes a sense of Chinese strength having recovered from COVID, or a concern about Xi Jinping not wanting to look weak. But this wasn't just about India. And so, yes, we can have the discussion about strongman and things like that, but I don't think this is about that.
Okay. I moved to ask you one question that I came upon in the foreign affairs piece, and this gets to this issue of the Quad, and we do have a question about the direction of U.S. From Christopher Woody about U.S. India defense cooperation. He's talking about how an interesting question. He says it. I don't know if you saw in the chat, but he said a B-1 bomber appeared at Aero India, and now this year an F-35. So what's the message? But let me add to that, though. I mean, you wrote in the foreign affairs piece that I think this must come from your book, but that in 1962, the Chinese military move against India was you said it was partly motivated by you, at least a perception of U.S.-India colluding in Tibet. So I mean, that I wonder if are you concerned that India could get too close to, say, Japan or the U.S. You also mentioned in your piece that the U.S. Army and Indian Army are exercising together near the Sino-Indian border. I think that's a first. Are you concerned that this could, how to put it, as cross a red line or something, and could set off, a conflict through the, say, like the security dilemma kind of thinking?
I think, there's a general sense in India that part of the problem is that China doesn't see China-India relations just in a bilateral sense, that it is increasingly seeing it through a US-China competition prism.
Yeah. What
I think people are baffled by, and maybe this shows a lack of, it's not just people always in India, like here, talk about not enough expertise on China in India, but perhaps the reverse, not an understanding in China of India, which is, if you're concerned about India through a US-China prism, the best thing for Beijing to have done was actually take Modi up on his offer. A Modi that was not necessarily inclined to be friendly to the US when he first came in, right? But even in the last few years, as with the Trump administration, you saw a brief period when China was concerned in 2017 about the Trump administration by the fall, where it suddenly starts reaching out to India, to Japan, and therefore you saw this Wuhan process in 2018, 2019. But the expectation in India was that, look, if you actually want to keep us non-aligned, so to speak, or at least, from leaning further towards the US, you actually stabilize relations. Instead, and this is maybe where you start to see kind of that security dilemma kick in, right? So you see an India that now sees China as not acknowledging the steps India took to not be provocative, but China seeing steps as provocative that India is taking in preparation. So, with every one of these crises, you see India suddenly see the US and others as more attractive partners because it cannot tackle China on its own, cannot establish deterrence in the region on its own. And so you start to see kind of this, cyclical and threat perception, which with each enhancing. So if you'd had a China that came in and said, look, I actually want to stem, and that was the instinct. For many years, there were certain things that India didn't do. It didn't agree to revive the Quad because it thought the reason 2020 is an inflection point is suddenly all those voices who had said, let's not do this stuff with the US or Japan or Australia or others because it'll provoke China. People were saying, well, they're getting provoked anyway, and now we've been left unprepared because we didn't.
Let me follow up with one more question, and we're running out of time, but I've got about a dozen more questions, but we'll a final couple of questions. One would be like, are you, I think we just saw a SIPRI report that says, world military spending is up to an unprecedented degree. And I know India is increasing its defense spending significantly. Where did I read something like 300 million for each of those P-8 anti-submarine aircraft it bought from the United States? I mean, are you concerned that this, in that guns and butter debate in India, that too much is going toward defense and acquiring foreign systems and so forth? That India could really suffer from a militarized rivalry, even if it doesn't, result in war, but just by virtue of, massive expenditures.
So I actually think on the guns versus butter, you could have seen a much greater percentage of GDP being spent. It's actually stayed fairly consistent. In fact, if anything, people are complaining that India's not spending like it actually has an urgent issue on the defense side. And, the thing about being a democracy in elections is what politicians are going to look at more is what's creating jobs. Now, to some extent, yes, that's going to be the defense industrial base that they want to enhance its indigenous defense industrial base, but you're still seeing a lot more spending on the butter side. To me, it depends on what you're spending on, right? So a P-8, for example, it helps in deterrence because it helps in detection. So anything that actually improves India's ability to actually detect if China might be moving and then send signals, because unlike the US and China, India and China actually do have crisis communications mechanisms in place. So to me, things that are investments in being able to verify whether or not the agreements are being respected, that kind of military capacity and anything that actually deters is not just good, it's essential. Because we have seen time and again that if those don't exist in place, and India wasn't making those investments, or at least they weren't, you didn't see kind of implementation, not just in terms of military, but even in terms of infrastructure in the region, developing border areas, etc. You're actually going to see unilateral moves that were deterred. So to me, the kind of if this is about deterrence, it's also why India doesn't want to engage in a arms race beyond the point. Part of this is India has a nuclear deterrent. The question is, and this is where we get into that cyclical thing, China is enhancing its nuclear deterrent vis-a-vis the US, but India is going to then need to react to China, and then you will see Pakistan reacting to India. So, you do see kind of, yes, there could be concerns, but one of the things about having a nuclear deterrent is India has not spent as much on conventional capabilities as it otherwise might have. And I think you're also seeing this is where partners come in. If India didn't have partnerships, didn't have agreements, information sharing agreements with the US that can help with some of that detection ability, it would need to spend more. So I think it's these partnerships are force multipliers, so that India doesn't have to spend as much.
Okay, one final question, and maybe we'll see if we can. This has been a pretty dark discussion, but see if we can maybe turn it in a slightly positive direction anyway. But I mean, do you have thoughts on how we could improve the relationship? There's a question Saul Wilson, for example, asked, he said it sounds like India is truncating some of the educational exchanges with China and so forth. I mean, do you have ideas for improving the relationship?
I think we have to accept. I think we just have to accept that the rivalry is going to continue. So we're not going to be able to get to a point where it's going to go away. But I think there needs to be kind of an investment in managing that rivalry. Now, as I said, the good thing is the mechanisms exist in the India-China case, but they have to be used. The downside is at the moment, I think we're just in a place, India and China are still talking. As much as things escalated, it could have got without those agreements. People talk about kind of diplomacy and it's not important anymore, but without those agreements that India and China, you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. People say they're dead. Well, they're damaged, but the fact that they existed meant you didn't have a shooting war beyond a point. It
yes,
didn't
I think that's very important to underline.
And so I think, for me, that, in terms of seeing silver linings to ensure that go back to those agreements, see where they need to be enhanced for today's age. I actually think improving anything that can verify, detect, verify, that can give both sides a reassurance about the other and what they're doing, particularly at the border, but can spill over. And I think the other aspect is much like, in there are these spaces in the multilateral sense where India and China do engage. And so I think continuing to leave those channels open, and also continue to, like I said, India-China trade has continued. And I actually do think de-risking is always better than decoupling, because frankly speaking, if it's going to be helpful, India would be more assured about an economic relationship with China if it's more balanced, if it is not overly dependent. So a certain amount of de-risking, I think, would be good and actually help stabilize a relationship, because you see less vulnerability and therefore kind of are less concerned in that case. I think on the exchanges, it's just a tough one. I think, there was for everybody, it was the kind of dual, 1-2 punch of these moves, but also COVID and that kind of shutting down. And I'm less optimistic in the India-China sense. I think the good thing is you've seen some think tank discussions restart, but I think, and there's still a number of Indian students in China. They're waiting for visas. So, it's if that can be sorted out. I think there were some announcements from the Chinese side. But you also saw recently, just in the last few weeks, China revoked the visas of some Indian journalists. So, and some journalists were very good and very balanced about reporting on China in India. And so it was a bit of a self-defeating move. And I hope those kind of things are reversed as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, okay, that's those are some really important points. And we will hope for the best and hope that your voice is, that maybe you can help turn this very difficult situation around a little bit. Some would say even that this could be maybe in a few decades the most important bilateral relationship in the world. So we've been thrilled to bring you this series, and we'll be very glad to welcome you to visit Brown in the near future and talk about Sino-Indian relations some more. Thank you so much, Tanvi Madan.